on today's episode.
I think tied into the discussion has to be, Christians especially have to remind the audience that this is life in the image of God. It may not be as great of a life as you wish you had. It may not be as valuable of a life as productive as life as you might have enjoyed at one time. But you still are not the author. You still do not have the authority to terminate it.
Welcome to the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. Our world today presents people with complicated issues of life and death, marriage and family, health and science. It can be a struggle to understand or deal with them. We're here to help by bringing good information and a fresh biblical perspective to these matters and more. Join us now for Life Challenges.
Hi, and welcome back. I'm Krista Potratz, and I'm here today with Pastors Bob Fleischman and Jeff Samuelson. And today we welcome you to the month of July, and we are going to talk about the current events from this past month. And I feel like there were, maybe I always feel like this, but there were a lot of current events.
Yeah. Yep.
A lot of things going on this past month. And the place that I wanted to start to, because I feel like the story got a lot of media attention, was there was a YouTuber who came out, I think his name was Jesse Ridgeway, and his wife Ashley, and they announced on their YouTube channel that they had aborted their child with Down syndrome. It's maybe hard to know exactly like everybody's motivation for posting everything on YouTube and stuff too, but it kind of seemed like, part of like them sharing the story was to maybe garner sympathy with people, letting them know, the real struggles, in their mind that they had gone through with this. Really, instead, while there was like some support that came out, there was a lot of backlash and a lot of talk then about Down syndrome. And it wasn't necessarily super shocking to me because we've talked about this on this podcast. And Bob, I know you've mentioned too about people that have aborted and made that decision with Down syndrome. And we've talked about like other countries as well. But yet, this really, I think maybe it was just the idea of like a face to it, that really made people go, oh boy, that doesn't really sound that great, or I didn't really know it was that bad, or people were doing this or that type of thing. And so I kind of just want to start there with thoughts of that. And then we'll kind of get into, we had found an article too on Down syndrome.
Yeah, I suspect that part of the problem was that by living his life out in the public so much that the Ridgeways kind of painted themselves into a bit of a corner here because they had publicized, oh, we're pregnant, we're so excited about this, so excited about this. And well, then when they decided to abort the child, they had to explain it. And whereas I think a lot of people would be a lot less public about, oh, we're pregnant, therefore they wouldn't have been in the bind that they ended up being in. But of course, the focus really ended up where it should be. Why are you deciding that children of a certain type you should kill and children of another type you should not kill? And they didn't think of it that way. And I would be almost certain, I haven't interviewed them, I haven't watched their videos or anything like that. I'd be almost certain that there was nobody in their lives as they were making the decision that told them, no, this isn't right.
Yeah.
In their lives, it would probably have just all been, oh no, that's going to be so difficult for you. This is the right call. And I would guess that they were probably very surprised at the response that they got. That was like, no, that's not what this is at all.
Well, in the Old Testament story of David taking Mephibosheth into his home, and it's one of those times in the Bible where it talks about somebody who had been crippled. He had been dropped as a child, and it created a mobility disability that he had. And David, of course, venerated him, really, gave him honor and brought him to his table and so forth. And there was something in the article when Ridgeway had talked about Down syndrome as objectively terrible and a glitch. And it brought back that memory. I think we talked about it here a previous time, or at least it was an article I'd shared with the board or something, that that there's this idea, and I think it was out of Christianity Today, this idea that we got to quit characterizing disabilities as a negative. So in our goal towards perfection, our eugenic goal towards creating heaven on earth, we got to keep filtering and filtering and filtering. And, so one leg shorter than the other, filter, what you have Down syndrome, filter, and that's kind of what it does. And it brought back that story I wrote like 20 years ago about Sarah Palin when she was diagnosed, when she was governor, that she was carrying a child, had a high chance of having Down syndrome. And one of the reporters asked her rather callously, well, how do your normal children feel about this? And she just, in a very classic Palin way, which said, well, how do you know that this child is not the one that's going to be normal? And I mean, we just kind of presume that Down syndrome is the disability. What if arrogant, intellectualism is actually the disability? And as Christians, we should know better. I mean, it's easy to sit back, in our bleachers and point an accusing finger at the Ridgeways and say, plus at 20 weeks into the pregnancy, we're talking, we're well along in development now. And then you just decided that somehow this was the better act of mercy. And it was predicated on a very shaded negative view of disability. And it's just horribly unfortunate.
Yeah. And I think too, what you said also too, Jeff, about like how there was probably no one really telling them like, this isn't a good idea. Have you thought about not doing this or that type of thing? It seems, too, like that the medical professionals, the genetic counselors, the people there, that they probably look to for just advice on like what to do, we're probably just saying most people do this. And I think like in his response and Ridgeway's response, he had said, 90% of people that get this type of diagnosis abort their child. In the article that you had found, it said, and the article is very interesting too. It was talking about like how we frame, but Bob was saying too, the story of Down syndrome, and that, I mean, it probably isn't that high with 90% of people aborting their child with that diagnosis. And I think the article cited maybe something more like 47. I know I've seen 60, and that's just the people that get the diagnosis. I mean, there's other people that, are going to say, well, we're not even going to get a diagnosis because it doesn't matter to us, one way or the other. But it does seem to really fit with like how the story is framed and what people are saying in this. Can you kind of describe a little bit of the article and that sense?
Oh yeah, I just thought it was a very powerful article. It's written by she has written some books. She hosts a podcast, Amy and Julia Becker, but she's not a big public figure or anything like that. And she's telling her own story, about her own daughter with Down syndrome. She starts off with the anecdote of when they found out about their daughter's diagnosis. She only had two different types of response to, there are the people who are just treating it as this horrible tragedy, and people who were treating it as just, it's all this wonderful thing. And it's like, neither was accurate. And she's saying, and her point is, we need to talk about this a different way. Really good paragraph here. The way we tell the story of Down syndrome both reflects who we are as a society and shapes who we are becoming. Is Down syndrome a tragedy, a burden, a set of medical problems that defy correction? Or is Down syndrome a life-changing, challenging, heart-opening, vulnerable genetic condition? The answer to these questions doesn't only affect women's decisions about pregnancy. The answer also affects the way doctors convey prenatal information, the tests insurance companies pay for, the funds available for early intervention and special education and governmental support. And so she's making the point that it's much bigger than this thing about, do we decide to abort our child once we get this diagnosis? It has to deal with all of society and support. And, the point Bob was making earlier about how do we look at disabilities? Are those just things that subtract from a person's humanity? Or are they just a different way of being human that we should value as much as anybody else?
What I always kind of go back to, like with abortion, is that the Ridgeways, they're parents now. They're parents of a dead child. And that's like when I think of it that way, it hits different than just, oh, we chose not to have this child, or we're gonna try again for, a different child or normal. It's like, no, you're already parents. Like I mean, that's the reality of a pregnancy. And whether it ends in a miscarriage or it ends in an abortion, that child is no longer there. But you can't erase their memory from existence completely, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
something happened so that they're not there. So yeah, I don't know. That's just kind of where I go, like, with all this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a society that's definitely obsessed with getting rid of burdens. About 35 years ago, I heard Hadley Arkes deliver a paper, and he was talking about burden, how people are saying, well, I don't want to be a burden, that kind of stuff. And I still remember him saying, he goes, I contend that the fabric of society is strengthened by its ability to carry burdens. And I think that there's evidence for that. I think that all of us it's almost like a natural, maybe our evil inclination to try to do everything we can to get rid of burdens. And yet I think the real tolerable people as your neighbors, as your friends, are the ones who have carried the greatest burdens in life. I like the way Jeff had pointed out that, when people looked at it from both perspectives, either that's terrible or, oh, that's just wonderful, that neither are true. I think that that's the way you got to approach it, is that it happens to be what comes your way, and then you go from there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jeff did a great job this month finding like articles that really talk about perspective, I think, too, just how we frame things. Another one, that I wanted to bring up too is when we're talking about assisted suicide. And I think this article that you had brought up here, Jeff, on assisted suicide talked about, I think it was like it started by talking about a recent article in the New York Times, I believe. It was saying that there was this article and it was about, these people going through assisted suicide. And it showed nice pictures of them and, in their life, but then talked about just like the burden and the tragedy, and with either it was mental illness or things they were going through that led them to these decisions. And nowhere in the article did it say, give like the suicide warning, like if you're experiencing these things, seek help, because of kind of the way we are framing assisted suicide as, like if it's coming from doctors and if it's coming from medical professionals, then it's okay. And I just found that as a very interesting take with that article.
Yeah, the article even had a very similar title to the previous one. We don't know how to talk about assisted dying, and you started off using the word suicide right away, but that's kind of the point of the article is all these people, is it suicide or isn't it? That's the big question. And from our perspective as pro-life Christians, like, well, yeah, if you are choosing death, choosing your own death, that's suicide. That's what that is. It doesn't matter that you're having a doctor assist you with it or not. It's kind of funny to think about. It's like, well, no, Your Honor, no, I didn't commit murder because I had a medical doctor assist me in killing the person. It's like, no, it's still the same thing, even if you got help with it. But it's a valuable article because it's calling out the fact that there's all this stuff written in the media today, especially much of it very sympathetic or promoting the idea of assisted suicide, that just leaves the word suicide out of it completely, leaves the concept of it out completely. And they don't seem to recognize at all the fact that the more you talk about, well, the way to end suffering is to choose death and get help doing it, that's going to impress upon people who are unhappy with their lives that, oh yeah, this is acceptable. This is a thing that I should have not only the option to do, but the right to do and be right in doing it.
I remember reading the article and found it interesting, but one deficit in it is that The same thing that occurred with abortion. We used to, in the very early years, in the early 70s, if we could just convince them that you're killing a baby. And of course, that was a big deal. The pro-life people were trying to impress that by showing you pictures of fetal development. And we would show you pictures of dead babies from an abortion clinic in a 5-gallon bucket, that kind of thing. It was trying to impress on them that they were killing. And then we found out that about 1995, I think it was, then the pro-abortion side was fine with saying, well, we recognize that in an abortion a child dies, but sometimes you got to do that for the sake of a higher ideal. And I think that that's going on with assisted suicide. Back when I was in a 3-way conversation with the late Derek Humphrey, and he made the comment, and it was on a radio broadcast, where he said that their goal with the Right to Die movement that he was involved with at the time, that their goal was to get people so used to talking about this that pretty soon they begin to want it. And I thought it was a very patient strategy, and it was a very sound strategy, and it's paying off now. And so he's getting people to do it. So I think I agree with the author of the article in that we have to call it what it is. It is suicide, but I think we're going to be shocked if we were to get our wish and call these what they are. How many of even our own people are going to say, well, at some time, maybe that's just the better way to go. And I think tied into the discussion has to be, Christians especially have to remind the audience that this is life in the image of God. It may not be as great of a life as you wish you had. It may not be as valuable of a life and productive as life as you might have enjoyed at one time. But you still are not the author. You still do not have the authority to terminate it. And this is becoming like a big issue in my world now. And you accept it as where God places you. And so I think I agree with the author. We got to get people to call it what it is because it's been shellacked so often. But I remember the first time I spoke on assisted suicide was at a councilman's conference in Milwaukee. And I remember talking about how terrible it was, and dementia is the opportunity for us to care for a loved one, that kind of thing. And I still remember one of the council members of a church in Milwaukee area getting up out of the meeting and said, if I have dementia, I just want them to push me off a cliff in a wheelchair and storm out. Because that's how people are. Because instead of placing God at the front of the line of what He have me to do, everybody's always thinking about, well, this is not how I want to live. This is not what I want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing that we've talked a lot about of the podcast here too, but Jeff had found a good article on IVF and how, again, like how the church can frame that.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was glad it wasn't me finding this article.
The name of it here is too, it was like IVF, the fractured right, and how the church should lead the conversation. So can you tell us a little bit about that article and how it talked about IVF?
Yeah, this was a refreshing article to read because this is I believe he's a Baptist pastor, just stating very directly something that he sees as a problem within contemporary church, I guess particularly the American church. You've got evangelicals, people who at least say they're about what the Bible teaches and about doing what's right and everything like that. It's just basically saying they refuse to talk about IVF. And what it really is and what it really involves. And says a lot of the cases it's because, there are people in this congregation who've used IVF and we dare not offend them. We dare not make them feel bad. And it is good and proper to be taking people's feelings into consideration, but it's also bad pastoral practice to not say anything just because you're afraid of maybe offending somebody. And he's basically pointing out that because of this, there are all sorts of Christians who aren't even aware that there is a controversy. And they should be aware of the controversy in terms of the children that are being destroyed in embryonic stages because of IVF and the way that procedure is done. And there's just a really strong encouragement through the article then for pastors to preach and for churches to teach openly and directly about this issue. And what I particularly appreciated is he wasn't just saying, talk about IVF. He's saying, build the foundation, teach all the things that people need to have as their base, so that then when you do talk about this issue, they'll understand it. That it won't just be, oh, well, my pastor is against this or my church teaches against this, but it's like, oh, of course we don't agree with that because the Bible says this. And I just thought it was a really well-written, well-timed article on the topic.
Jeff makes a great point. So often with what we do here at CLR, everyone thinks of the issue. We could be talking about IVF, we could be talking about assisted suicide, we could talk about abortion, and you're always kind of characterized by what you're for or what you're against. And of course, a lot of people are simplistic. They don't want to check into why. And I think it does require a lot of deliberate attention within a congregation to form a life ethic that is God-focused, not people-focused, and so forth. But I've gotten that criticism over the years a number of times where right out, where somebody says, I wish you wouldn't talk against IVF so often. My children had IVF and I've got this wonderful child and everything like that. First of all, Scripture is full of examples of wonderful, incredible things coming from bad circumstances, and intentionally, not just bad circumstances, but intentionally bad actors, people who do bad things. But that doesn't lend validity to the bad that's been done. Part of that is that arrogance in all of us. At some point, you're going to have to say that I was willing to turn a blind eye to this. I was willing to ignore the ramifications. I intentionally sought ignorance, or I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I was so anxious, so desperate for the positive. And we've talked about IVF enough times in the past here that people know that there's a problem with it, and that is that you have to destroy lives in order to get life. And that's just a problem. And I still tell people, if you want to navigate the problem, just change IVF embryos into 2-year-olds, sit in the nursery and say, well, how many of those are you willing to get rid of before you could take one home? And of course, once you think of it that way, well, then it sounds so much harsher. But either you're believing what Scripture says, or you're picking and choosing that which makes you feel more comfortable. Nothing we've ever said criticizing IVF is to slight the wonderful blessing of a child that's born. We love children. We love children very much. But we do not think we ought to be in the business of terminating some lives in order to have a life. Mm-hmm. And that's the point he was making. How do you create that life ethic? You start by asking, what would God have before what would I want?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I mean, that really, it translates to what you're saying too, a lot of things we talk about. I mean, even just the whole living together outside of marriage and stuff as well. Yeah. It's people, they see these things out there, I think, that in their mind, everybody does. Or when you don't have a kid, then you use IVF. Or when you don't want to have a kid yet, you use hormonal birth control. Or when you know that this is the person for you, you want to live with them, or you see these things and they're accepted in society, and you just maybe start to kind of create a narrative where God's got to be okay with it if
it's
this
so prevalent.
Yeah. And if it's just a part of our culture and that type of thing. And without really, what you're saying and what this article is saying too, looking at the foundation of God's word and all these things. And then when you really know that and you really understand, I think you mentioned even just the image of God as one of them, and just all the, then you really have a foundation to think, okay, what does God really want for my life, and what is my way of showing my love to God too in that response.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, moving on to an article that ties in, I think, especially to Bob, when you were talking about Down syndrome and people thinking that that's a burden and wanting to get rid of disabilities. You had found this article where it was talking about a woman who is very into genetically modifying babies. And I was honestly fascinated by this woman, just the article and everything too. I think it even started with with her on her like 30th birthday, playing piano in Carnegie Hall, and just showing this very young, driven woman who is really wanting to genetically modify children, and wanting to be like very transparent about it too. Okay, this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it this way. And let's gain support for this model.
This should sound a little deja vu-ish in that's another technical term, deja vu-ish. But when we talked about the Chinese doctor, I think his name was He Jiankui, and he used to go by JK, I found. He was in his young 30s, and he had done some genetic modification of two children. And then we found out later that there was a third one that he had been involved with. And he ended up doing prison time for doing it and everything. The irony is that the story about this lady, who's like 30 or 31 at her party and stuff like that, she supposedly had married this guy. It's funny because you find different sources. Some say they claimed they were married, but then they really weren't and stuff like that. But there's a common relationship between them. But the premise has always been the same. I watched the video of her, let's just say her former husband. I watched a video of JK when he was introducing his concept. The premise is always the same thing. Such wonderfully good things can come of this. And I remember, I can hear the moment I was watching him say those words, all I could recall was James Watson, who died here not too long ago, but he was one of the discoverers, won the Nobel Prize, I think it was in 1957, for discovering the double helix in DNA. He became the original supervisor of the Human Genome Project, but he's the one who said at the dinner, when somebody asked him if you were playing God by learning all about the human gene and all that kind of stuff, and he just said, I see only good coming from this. And again, we love the good that can come from it. But the problem is that you got to remember that what he means by good and what you mean by good could be two very different things. There might be some common ground, and that's where it always begins. Because JK, when he did this, called the Chinese Frankenstein, they called him, it was the idea of editing out what could cause HIV. And so now they called her Biotech Barbie, this woman, Kathy Tai, that what she was doing too is really nothing but good. Is that necessarily wrong in and of itself? And we get back to a problem that we've had in all of our discussions in these podcasts over the years, and that is we don't know what people mean by good. Good because they are biblical, sound Christian, good because a couple of us all agree on one definition of good, or good by their own definition. Now, when Adolf Hitler set out to do good, his interpretation of good was dramatically different than most of us. So this is really a cutting edge issue. How do you rein in people who are very subjective about what is good?
One point particular to that, but I wanted to say something first, just that we as pro-life Christians, we should be careful to appreciate how exciting all of this can be for people who don't have the hang-ups we have about things like God's gift of life, the right to life, people who are more interested in progress than in prudence. This is exciting stuff. It's like, oh, wow, the things we could do. But some of the things that this lady was thinking about doing was creating unicorns genetically with horse embryos and things like that. And it's it's a long article, but if you have the time to read it, I would say do so, because it really shows an insight into, you get more of a picture of her personality and such. I am not a psychologist, and it would be, even if I were, it would be improper for me to diagnose someone based just on reading an article, but it makes me think of, at the very least, narcissism, in the sense of, every thought that I have is good. If I have an opinion, it must be right. And that sense of, I define what is good. Or perhaps going the next step up to sociopathy, that sociopathic personality is pretty much identified by a lack of a conscience. You are aware that conscience exists. You are aware that, you need to talk about, things in a certain way so that other people aren't, offended and such. But you don't actually have one yourself that stops you from doing things. It just reminds me of there's a science fiction series called The Expanse. I've never watched the TV version. I read the first of the books in the series, but one of the things that always struck me was that there was a group of people who were trying to do some cutting edge research, really important project, but they recognized that there were dangers and immoralities involved, and so they recruited only sociopaths as their researchers because they knew they would just do what they wanted done without worrying about the consequences. And it's this kind of project that makes me think of that, because it's saying, well, we're just going to move forward because there's so many good things beyond that they just pretty much refuse to think about the things that could be behind. There was an example in here. It's like, well, people talk about eugenics. I don't want to talk about eugenics. Basically anything that made her uncomfortable or whatever.
Yeah.
She's just like,
I
no,
noticed
we're
it
not
a
going to
few
talk about
times.
that. So.
Yeah, no, real interesting article. I agree. If people have the time to read that, definitely should. Another one I wanted to touch on here too was, Bob, you had found one on moral acceptability falls for several behaviors. This was a new Gallup poll that showed morally acceptable behaviors and just how they have changed or what they're at now and stuff too. And I thought that it was real interesting to see what is kind of considered morally acceptable and what, maybe most Americans don't necessarily agree with yet.
Well, they had identified birth control outside of marriage, pregnancy, gambling, teenage sex, and cloning animals as having kind of fallen in acceptability. And I did a lot of, I read the article, it caught my attention. I did a lot of reading outside of the article, trying to figure out what causes that. And there's a lot of great theories as to what causes it. And perhaps the one that rose to the top was the one that says that after a long period of liberalization, people tend to plateau. There is kind of an area of uncomfortableness, and there's certain terms in philosophy for that where you got to keep moving. If you're going to move that whole band progressively, you got to stay within the band, but you keep poking at the top of it, and you keep poking, and if you poke too much, it creates almost like a ricochet. And so I think that that's the prevailing theory, is that, because we see that in LGBTQ plus, where they feel that they've overplayed their hand. Now all of a sudden society is rebounding back. And so that's kind of one of the theories. And then they'll say there also is an uptick in young people coming back to church. And so is that it? There's a lot of those theories. I think they're all valid. I think there's merit to all of those theories, why it is. Personally, I wish the real root of it is going back to a theme we've touched on in a number of these stories. You keep recognizing God's centrality in all of life and our responsibility to Him, and that it keeps moving that pendulum back to God's realm. But I don't think that that's one. I think even saying that there's a surge of young people coming back to church, does not equate to a surge in young people learning God's way. It's just a surge of young people coming back to church. And so the hour dosage you get on a Sunday morning, and then you're still bombarded by the world. But I thought it was interesting enough to share the article because people are following these things and they're asking the questions why. And I think we could all be players in moving that marker one way or the other.
Yeah, and I mean, this would be a great conversation starter for Christians who are trying to witness to the truth, or what makes us different, why we have hope and everything like that. Kind of the selling point of the article, is like, well, I'm happy for all the things that have dropped in terms of moral acceptability. I'm still unhappy, though, about all the things that still have moral acceptability that shouldn't. There are a lot that are pretty high up there that we as Christians would say, that should be 0 on there, and it's actually, in the 50s and 60s and 70% there. Like 65% find morally acceptable that unmarried men and women have sex. We're not surprised by that figure, but it's not what we'd like to see.
And by the way, a figure like that reflects, remember the reasons I gave for, why we're plateaued. Well, obviously we haven't plateaued in that regard, or even with more young people going to church, it's still 65%. So it tells you that there's still something hollow going on.
Yeah. Yeah. And, if this were, if they came to me and said, would you take our survey? I would probably not, because of the way some of the questions are. It was like, is divorce morally acceptable or not?
That too. Yeah.
Well, it depends on what the reason for the divorce is, doesn't it? I'm not going to say it's morally wrong for a woman whose husband cheated on her to get a divorce, because it's not. But the question doesn't allow room for that. Another one that got me, and this is the kind of thing that you could get into a good conversation about it, particularly as a pro-life Christian, when it says having a baby outside of marriage. I see absolutely nothing morally wrong with having a baby outside of marriage. That should be 0. It's what caused the baby to come into existence where the moral question is. Two people who are not married to each other should not be producing babies. That's where the moral thing is. But once that child exists, it should be born.
Yeah, it's like what we talked about with IVF.
Yeah.
Yeah, we love the baby, stuff like that. It's what led up to it that's a problem.
Yeah. And, getting things like that wrong, it affects our witness. Because, if you say, well, it's morally wrong to have a baby outside of marriage, well, then, what is that telling the children who were born that way, and what is it saying about your capacity for compassion and love for the mother who chooses to have that child rather than abort it? These are things that there is nuance that needs to be appreciated.
Well, that is all we have time for this month. But thank you both for discussing these articles today. And we thank all of our listeners. And if you have any questions on any of these articles, you can reach us at lifechallenges.us. And we thank you so much for joining us today. Our podcast is made possible because of you, because you listen. And we thank you so much for that. We look forward to seeing you back next time. Bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Life Challenges podcast from Christian Life Resources. Please consider subscribing to this podcast, giving us a review wherever you access it, and sharing it with friends. We're here to help, so if you have questions on today's topic or other life issues, you can submit them, as well as comments or suggestions for future episodes at lifechallenges.us or email us at podcast@christianliferesources.com. You can find past episodes and other valuable information at lifechallenges.us, so please check it out. For more about our parent organization, please visit christianliferesources.com. May God give you wisdom, love, strength, and peace in Christ for every life challenge.